Welcome, everyone, to our webinar today, the EV Magic Number. I'm Bryce Evans. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Auto Service Leader, and we have a really cool presentation for you today. We're really excited about it. It's going to be very unique and something you have not seen yet in this industry, which we really appreciate Carolyn taking the time to come on and do that with us. So one of the cool things about what we get to do at Auto Service Leader is we get to be very picky about the different partners and people that we work with throughout the industry. And we've had the pleasure of working with Carolyn and Earthling Automotive for the last year or so. And one of the things that they can truly do for this industry is offer a unique perspective on how you can take advantage of technological shifts within your marketplace, how to truly capitalize on the opportunity that is there within your own community already to engage some of these new customers that you might not be getting in your door. So we're going to have a presentation on that today. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started, though. We do have a chat feature and a Q&A feature. Kate, our wonderful producer, who is in the room behind me here at our global headquarters of Auto Service Leader, just put the link in the chat feature right here in our Google Meet. If you take that, it takes you to an app called Slido. That's where we'll do our Q&A. We'll have Q&A at the end. So Carolyn's going to run through a presentation, give us a lot of awesome information. We'll store up your questions. I'll ask them at the end. If you do have something that's urgent, that's topical, right, with what she is talking about, we'll be monitoring the chat, and I'll chime in and ask her and interrupt her and get your questions answered. The other part of this is we are recording this. So if you're on right now, it's awesome. You're here live. It's going to be great. If you do have to hop off at any point, you can go back and rewatch sections of it. We will have it all available to you within 24 hours of this wrapping up. So we'll send that out via email, your direct link to it, and you'll have access to that on demand moving forward. And I think that was it for housekeeping notes. The other part of it, if you do have questions or issues or having trouble with the audio, Kate is on here producing, so she will be monitoring that and can help you out if there are any questions you have about how to change feeds, how to rearrange things. I think you can make it to where you never have to look at me, which a lot of people are probably already clicking away and doing. You can set it up however you want within the system. Kate will help you out if you do have any questions. She's on here to help. And without further ado, we'll bring on Carolyn. So if you don't know Carolyn Cocolette, she is one of the industry's leading innovators. She has started a whole bunch of different businesses, but one of the key things we're going to focus on today is what she has done in the place of both hybrids and electric vehicles. So if you're unaware, Carolyn has not only once, but twice started a shop and a business that is taking advantage of an emerging trend within her market that she identified, was able to be a first mover on and really capitalize on that opportunity. And one of the great things about people like Carolyn is that when they do these awesome things and they're very successful at it, their biggest thing they want to do is share with other people and show you how to do it. So that is what Carolyn is here to do today. And Carolyn, thanks for being on.
Right. I'm been terribly flattered. Those are very nice words. Thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to be able to do this presentation with you. Such a high caliber, incredibly dedicated person to this industry. And it's been a pleasure to work together as partners, sponsoring Auto Service Leader. So watching your journey, and kudos to you and everything you're doing. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody here to be able to share some of what we've got going on and put it part of the auto service ecosystem. So I see a lot of familiar faces joining this webinar, which is awesome. It's great to see you all again. And thanks for taking some time out of your busy day to listen to some of the stuff that I've been working on. The sort of high level purpose of this presentation is to give you some more perspective on strategy, specifically as it pertains to electrified vehicles, so hybrids and electrics, which of course, I've been involved in for quite a while. But, I don't need to preach to this group about strategy. If you're tuning into Auto Service Leader, it's because you're already paying attention to your business. You're already tuned into strategy. And again, I'm proud to be a supporter of Bryce and Earthling to Auto Service Leader. That's exactly why we're here, is because we think that they're producing really amazing content, and that's the right channel to be listening to understand where to position your business. Folks are certainly probably aware of, I've had a couple of businesses that were focusing on hybrids and now electric cars. I'll talk a little bit more about Earthling Automotive, which is the current shop that I run. I was also CEO of Shopware, a shop management system, for the last 11 or so years. And it's nice to have sort of reached a conclusion to that tenure and have a chance to pop my head back up really in the shop owner space and share more of what I'm passionate about there. But the sort of headline is that even though I was running that company, I've always kept my ear to the ground on what's going on with the shop owner side, right? Of course, because if you've been my customer, I've been a customer. But additionally, what did I want to do with Luscious? And there's a couple of things. My first shop, Luscious Garage, that I might have a chance to share in more detail later about why we decided to move that business over to an EV focus and rename it Earthling Automotive. I've talked about that in different presentations. But really what we're talking about here is recognizing the EV market opportunity. And so I had a hunch a couple of years ago, a little bit longer than that, probably like 3 years ago now, that this was starting to become real. And even though I was preoccupied with my software company, I was still starting to listen, pay attention. I started working with a couple other co-founders, and we decided to take the leap. We actually opened 2 years ago. It was December. We signed the lease of 2022. So we've been at this for 2 years. So, that was sort of my coming to this conversation and when was the right time to make the leap. Of course, we've learned a lot in the last 2 years, which is something I'm going to share with you here. But in addition to sort of like what's going on at the repair shop, the question is, what do you need to do to understand your market? It's one thing to be sitting, at sort of the epicenter of hybrids and EVs, San Francisco, Bay Area, California, but you're not necessarily here. And the information that we receive often about what's going on in the EV market is mostly around sales. So you hear a lot about how many EVs have sold, and sometimes you hear really astounding numbers like EVs are, flying off the charts, and California is going to prohibit gasoline in 10 years, and so on and so forth. And then you'll hear the exact opposite. EVs are dead. They can't sell a Tesla to save their lives. And so it's really hard to know, what's going on in the marketplace, especially if you're just listening to sales data, because of course we don't work on new cars, right? It's hard to remember, but the first full electric OE manufacturing mass-produced cars came out in 2012. 2012 with the Nissan Leaf. 2013 is when Tesla released the Model S, and that's over 10 years ago. These cars are getting old. And so then the question becomes, okay, I, like Carolyn, have been keeping my ear to the ground and listening to what's going on this side of the marketplace. When is it time for me to make the leap? And that requires, first of all, it's a very important decision because you're going to have to invest in training. I have some information about training a little bit later if we have a little more time. But independent of sort of solutions for training, you're going to, after that, have a big investment in marketing. Now you're going to start shifting your position in market, and you're going to want to talk to these people. And that costs money. If those people don't really exist or they're not ready, then don't spend that money. Of course, don't spend that money on training either. So this is an important decision, like all the decisions we make for our businesses. And so realizing this, and when I was starting to take this back to be able to make a presentation of the greater market, it's like, how do I make this information about market readiness more relevant to the broader audience, the broader group, not just to me, not just to people who necessarily are living in metro areas or in California. And that requires two different pieces of information. So the first information that you need is registration data. So how many cars are actually on the road? And that is as a comparison to gasoline cars. Because even if you understand there's, I don't know, 50,000 EVs in your market, well, what does that mean? Is that a lot or a little? You have to think about what that number is as a comparison to the total number of cars. We're just going to say gas cars, because those are the cars you're already servicing. And then you have a reference point. Also, that's how you can compare your marketplace to someone who's in Maine or in Chapel Hill or Dallas. Right? All of us are in different markets. We have different number of cars flying around us. And so understanding kind of, what your net's going to pick up if you stick it out there in the market breeze is a comparison to the total number of cars that are in that breeze. So I'm going to share that information with you. And then additionally, we're going to talk about how that information is pertinent to your specific market. Now, I can't go, if there's 100 people on this webinar, I can't go give each one of you your specific metric. But I'm going to give you your state's metrics, and that will allow you to extrapolate sort of what's going on in your area, because you kind of know where you are within your state. So that's what we're going to dig into today. And I think that's really exciting, because this is the information that you can actually arm yourself with, instead of just taking kind of an anecdotal approach, or like, gee, I'm at a stoplight and there seem to be a lot of other Teslas at the stoplight, making a data-driven decision. So let me start by sharing my screen here. And I can see you. I think that's correct. Can you see that, Bryce? I think so. Yell out if you can't see that. Yes, I see a thumbs up. Great. Thank you, everyone. So here we are looking at the 50 states in the United States, as well as District of Columbia, DC. So there's 51 areas shown here. And what I like to do is survey the group and say, what do you think these states have in common? There's a group of states on the left-hand side, and there's a group of states on the right-hand side. And go ahead, settle into your chair, pour yourself that cup of coffee, because we're going to be talking about these groups of states for a little while here. So you might wonder, okay, what do these guys have in common? You could say, okay, the left-hand side of the blue states and the right-hand side of the red states, or the blue states, the left-hand states, are on coasts or whatever. And of course, once you start reading down the list, you realize that there's a lot of exceptions, right? There's states in the middle of the country, like Minnesota, where Bryce is, on the left-hand side. There are some highly populated, larger states, like Texas, on the right-hand side. So, this is kind of an interesting cluster. And you might have guessed that since this is a presentation on electric vehicles, that this has something to do with electric vehicles. And if you did guess, you would be right. This is a distribution of states that have more or less than a threshold of what I'm calling XEVs. This is a standard term, but you folks who don't know it, XEVs is sort of for hybrids, all electrics. It's a overarching umbrella term for electrified vehicles. Above and below a threshold of XEVs. And what's interesting about that threshold, and we'll talk more about that, of course, is that it bifurcates, divides the number of areas that we have in our country pretty evenly. There's 24 on the left. There's 27 on the right. I think 57% of the population is on the left. 43% of the population is on the right. So it's a pretty even division. So the threshold that I mentioned is 4 XEVs per 100 gas cars. And this is a ratio. So this is 4 to 100. And on the left-hand side, you see that these are all the states that have a XEV number of 4 or greater. And the exact number 4 is for Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania just made the cut. And the states on the right-hand side have XEVs of less than 4. And you can see that here. And of course, you can quickly find your state and find out what your number is. This number, which we're calling for the sake of this webinar, the EV magic number, we can call sort of in shorthand, I like to call it E2G, or electrified to gas. And what this is doing is precisely what I was saying at the beginning of the talk, which is you need to be able to know the number of electrified cars compared to gas cars in your area. So, for example, in California, it happens to be very high, and that's not necessarily surprising. So there are 11 effectively electrified cars for every 100 gas cars. The only one that's higher is District of Columbia. DC is 11.4, and we don't need to preoccupy in that because there's not that many cars there. But California obviously dominates. And then we go down from there. What's also interesting about the ratio 4, which is this threshold, to 100 gas cars, is that it's easily divisible. So if you take, divide 4 by 4, you get 1. You divide 100 by 4, you get 25. So the ratio of 4 to 100 is effectively equivalent to 1 to 25. And so you can see that, All the states on the left-hand side have one electric car for 25, or electrified car for every 25 gas cars or less. So for California, there's one of these cars for every 9 gas cars. In Washington State, there's one XEV for every 11 cars. Oregon's one for every 12. Utah, again, might be surprising that Utah is on the left-hand side. One for every 19 cars. And then finally, this, threshold, 1 for 25, is precisely where Pennsylvania is at 4.0. And what's cool about that is that you can actually envision 25 cars. You can see a parking lot of 26 cars in it. And if you're looking at a parking lot of 26 cars in your area, well, depending on what your number is, in the case of Pennsylvania, there would be one electrified car for every of the other 25 that were regular gas cars in that parking lot, on average. So you can actually start to put your mind around this, which is, of course, the problem, is that you're trying to really conceive what's my actual market size. Okay, cool. So that's E2G. Let's talk about the right-hand side really quick. So we'll talk more about why I think 4% is, or, a 4 E2G is a good threshold in a little while. But we can take a look at the folks that are on the right-hand side, which is kind of interesting too. So North Carolina, right over here at 3.9, just didn't make the cut. So North Carolina almost made it to the left-hand side of this slide. Idaho, Georgia, Washington, Wisconsin, Montana, they're all around 3.5. So that's one electrified car for every 29 gas cars. When we get down closer to 1, it's 1 for every 50. So that's like Alabama, West Virginia, Wyoming. And then Mississippi is the lowest, 1.5. And that's one electrified car for every 67 gas cars. Interesting there, of course, is that 25 cars to 65 cars may not actually feel like a lot of more cars, or 50 cars or so. But you see how that ratio starts to really pan out in how many cars am I likely to see. Like if anyone's going to open a shop specializing in electric cars, I wouldn't recommend opening it in Mississippi, obviously. So you can start to conceptualize the data compared to what you kind of already know instinctually. Okay, so again, to remind you, these counts include hybrids. So we're talking Prius plus Tesla, and of course, all the other hybrids and all the other PHEVs, plug-in hybrids, all the other pure electric cars, battery electrics, are all into this number. And that's important because, those cars all have essentially the same components. So if you're going to be going into electrics, you're going into hybrids. And if you're going into hybrids, you're going into electrics because they have the same components and the same level of competency that you're going to need to be able to bring to the table. And if you're thinking about whether you're going to go for that market, some of you are already doing hybrids. I see your names coming up, Travis Stecker, I'm talking to you in the feed. You're probably doing a lot of hybrids. As you're looking towards EVs, again, when you start to look at these as a combined cohort, when does it start to make sense? If you want to go into more detail and parse EVs versus hybrids, I have some resources later on in the presentation that you can do to sort of hone in on those numbers. But for most folks that are still flying over this and sort of maybe you're dabbling a little bit in Prius now, maybe you've done a hybrid battery, but if you actually want to hang a shingle and start, marketing to this space, how many of those cars are you talking about? I'm treating those two markets, the hybrid and electric car market, together, and I think you should too. Again, not only does this have a sense of putting this into real terms, this is an apples to apples comparison. So these ratios apply to whatever concentration of cars happens to be in your market. So we're looking at Colorado versus Connecticut. We're looking at, Idaho versus, I don't know, Florida. These are real apples to apples numbers, which is actually also kind of surprising, right? That you can start to understand oh, actually, despite having what I thought was a lot fewer EVs than say, Florida, my E2G is actually a lot closer. And that's partly the reason why Bryce decided to have me provide this or present this presentation or give this presentation was that this is actually starting to become a substantive number, and it's universal across most markets. So California, of course, has the most number of cars and the most number of electrified cars in this group. Can anyone, well, you probably can't tune in, but I'll give it away. The second highest, like just raw number of in this case EVs, which talk pure electrics for a second. The second highest market to California is Texas. And you'll notice that Texas is over here on the right-hand side. And we'll talk a little bit about volume versus a comparison to gas cars in a bit. So when you're thinking about this, just because you're right on the right-hand side doesn't necessarily mean that you want to write electric vehicles off. In other words, it depends. And I'll give you some more information about that. But those kinds of numbers, the raw numbers, is where we've been, right? That's what we've talked about a lot. Oh, there's so many cars in Texas. Okay, yeah, but Texas is a big state. I mean, if you're in Dallas or Houston or Austin, you know this already. You may be already looking at EVs or doing them. And so, you know, the Texas 3.4 ratio is applying to the entire state of Texas, means it's a lot more concentrated in those larger metropolitan areas. So anyway, that gives you a little bit more reference, which you can take forward. So now let's talk about this magic number that Carolyn has decided is important. Let's validate this. Okay, why is 4 as a threshold matter? And I've got some more on this as it pertains to my personal experience. I've already said that I think it's useful because it allows us to rank all regions of the United States comparatively. And it's interesting that the threshold happens to separate the bunch almost evenly, which is useful. It's an interesting breakpoint. You see Texas is on the right-hand side despite being the second highest market. The third highest market for all electrics is Florida. So California, Texas, Florida. Florida is on the left-hand side, 4.5. So anyway, it's an interesting kind of litmus test, if you will. And that's why we're calling it the magic number, obviously for promotional purposes. I do think it's fairly magic, and it's useful for us to start to think about when we're getting ready. But what else can we do to sort of give this threshold perspective? And for that, I have another segment of data. And this is light duty diesels. This includes like F-150s and trucks as well, but light duty diesels to 100 gas cars, which you could call D to G, right? Instead of E to G, it's D to G, it's diesels to gas cars. So the exact same calculation as it pertains to diesels. Now, you're not talking medium and heavy, you're not talking 250, F-250s and stuff like that. But still, when we talk about diesels, we consider diesels to be a legitimate thing to potentially work on. It's something that many of us already work on in our shops. There's certainly specialty shops. It's a long-standing channel for auto repair. Certainly for folks that specialize, they love it because it gets very expensive, and that's great. So we like diesels. Anyway, how does that compare as a threshold to gas, even in all of these other states? And as you probably would have guessed, there are more folks above the 4-point threshold on the right-hand side. So there's 16 states that have a D to G greater than 4. And you'll see 12 of them over here on the right-hand side. So these states have fewer EVs per gas cars compared to the total group, but these folks also have higher diesels to gas cars as compared to the group. So maybe they like diesels more than electric cars for various and sundry reasons. And there are some, intuitive results here. We see, North Dakota and South Dakota both have 7.1. We probably could have guessed that. They have less than 2 or right around 2 of an E to G. So yeah, maybe focus on diesels in those areas and less on electric cars. But what about the folks on the, excuse me, one more point I want to make. What's also interesting is to look at Kansas, for example. Kansas just makes the mark, just makes the 4-point threshold over here on the right. So they're like the equivalent of Pennsylvania on the left-hand side. That might surprise you, right? We might think that there's a lot more diesels to gas cars in Kansas. And what makes that also very interesting is that they have a 3.1 E to G, which is to say that the number of electrics versus the number of diesels compared to gas cars, everybody else, is getting pretty close. And folks that are in, Overland or Kansas City proper probably are starting to feel this. Same thing with Arkansas and Oklahoma, even Nebraska. Their numbers are starting to creep up. And so that's, as a comparison to diesels, that's really interesting. Okay, so I said there were 12 states on the right. The total number is 16. So the question is, what folks on the left-hand side have a D to G greater than 4? And I will show you those now. So Colorado, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. Utah, probably not surprising. It does have higher number of diesels to electrics, but again, over 4. But look at Colorado. Colorado has 4.5, and its E to G is 2.6. That might surprise you that Colorado has more EVs than electrified cars than diesels. And then, of course, both Oregon and Washington are over the 4-point threshold, but they have more electrified cars than diesels in total. And, in Washington, that's by a pretty large margin. Now, what's also interesting to note is that all the rest of these states have a D to G, diesel to gas, of less than 4. So that means that the majority of states do not have diesels at a greater concentration. And yet a lot of people in those states are still focusing on diesel cars or inviting those cars into their shops. So as you're starting to think about how many actual EVs, electrified cars, are there for me to potentially service, and when does this market become legitimate? My question to you is, how do you feel about the diesel market in your area? And again, now you suddenly have a reference point for how many electrics are there compared to cars you already know. It gives you something that you can already understand based on your existing experience. So that's why I like 4 as a threshold. Not only that, we recognize that there's a lot of money in diesels, and so for folks that are already seeing a diesels in their shop that have a less than 4.0 ratio, then again, that's another signal that you might be ready to think about EVs as well as a market segment. The other thing is that this corresponds to my experience in my own shop. So I've got some data here, and for folks that are in California or otherwise just want to geek out, you can go to this website about data that's available in California on electrified cars. So it does segment hybrid cars, but it goes into super detail on all electrics by county. So we're talking statewide for the folks that are not in California. In different areas, you can go in and look at this registration data by county or by zip. So you can actually get a finer point on this ratio depending on where your data is stored in which state. Some states don't provide that information, but many do. Anyway, California, of course, is very good about this. And when I look at the hybrid market, this is 14 years ago. So back in 2010, which this website supports, I can go back and look at registrations of hybrids in 2010. And you can see this on the right-hand side. We've got 5 different counties all surrounding San Francisco highlighted. So this is the data source. The ratio of hybrids to gas was 3.1. And this is 2010. I had already been in business 3 years. And then the ratio in the actual county of San Francisco, hybrids to gas, was 4.1. Now, at the time, it felt like, there were a lot of cars, and I was anxious to get started and get going at it. And the reality is, when I first opened in 2007, we were early. So even though there were cars driving around, it was, harder to potentially, get those cars into the shop. It wasn't until 2010 that market started to mature. And if I had been paying more attention to numbers like this, I would have probably known better when was the right time to make the leap. And for us, it was right around 2010. That was when the business got really good. And that had just happened to be also when the concentration was over this 4-point threshold. Fast forward to all electric cars. So now we're putting hybrids aside. We're just looking at pure EVs, which of course a lot of folks like to talk about because they're newer and we're a little scared of how the hell we're going to get information and parts from Tesla and so on. So a little more mysterious. This is in 2020, and I'm using the data from 2020 on purpose because these are the cars that we can guess are 4 years old now. So how many of them are coming out of warranty now? And so the Bay Area ratio is 2.8. And again, the ratio in my county, the county of San Francisco, is a little bit higher at 3.0. And that's good news, I guess, in the sense that there are cars for my shop, Earthling Automotive, to work on that are out of warranty, but it's still a little early, right? Still below 4. And we live that. We're still doing a lot of work to try to pull these all-electric cars in. Now, granted, we fill the whole shop with lots of other hybrids, plug-in hybrids, et cetera, which is why I'm telling you that the XEV, the blended market is where you should be looking. But even for us, as we're trying to go hard, plant the flag, be first mover on all electric cars, you can see where that ratio starts to play. So this is relevant even in my own market, in the most concentrated area in California. One interesting, thing on this, I'm gonna actually take a sip. For you data nerds, this is where it gets really juicy. So I'm flashing this. I'm not expecting us to cover all of this on this presentation. I'm going to move forward fairly quickly here, and I do want to leave time for questions. Is taking a look at the data in these 5 counties. This is the 5 counties surrounding San Francisco. So this is my market. On the left-hand side, you see the snapshot of registrations in 2020, which is what I was referring to on the previous slide, because these are the cars that are presumably out of warranty. Now there's cars that are much older than 4 years, right? These are all cars that were registered back then. So I'm getting all the 2013 Model S's and the Nissan Leafs and stuff like that into this cohort. And then on the right-hand side, this is at the end of year 2023. So fast forward essentially 3 years. So that's the most recent data that I can get access to. I'll be very excited to get the 2024 data shortly. What's fascinating about this is that if you look at the number of total battery electrics, this is the number, I can't use my mouse, but sort of in the lower left-hand corner of that first blue pane, you'll see battery electric BEV 2.48% in 2020 was roughly 80,000 cars. Okay, 80,000 cars, cool. Now let's look at that same number 3 years ahead. So battery electric over here on the right-hand side, you see it's 207, so it's 208. Okay, so it's basically 107,000 more cars, more than doubled the market. And that's awesome. Okay, cool. There seems to be a lot more EVs now. That seems good for Carolyn. What's fascinating is when you look down into the actual counts of the individual makes and models. So just drop your eyes a little bit. You'll see Tesla is the largest number of EVs by make. And then you see by model, you'll see the Model Y, which is 4 down under Tesla, has a little shy of 5,000 cars there. And if you glance over here on the right-hand side, you see that the Model Y has 55,000 cars. So the amount of growth in the Model Y is like astounding, right, over this same 3-year period. And that's because they released the Model Y in 2020. There weren't very many of them at the end of 2020. Okay, fine. But what's interesting and meaningful about that from a data perspective is that when you are driving around or you're walking around San Francisco or even in any of your markets and you're looking at the EVs, you'll see Model Ys everywhere. It's the best-selling EV by far. It outsells all the rest of the Teslas, and it's basically the Prius of electric cars. And yet they basically didn't exist 4 years ago. So when you're thinking about what are the EVs that I can actually service, it's much different to just look at what's driving around versus what's available to roll into your shop, especially because there's been so much EV sales in the last 4 years. So this is meant to just be kind of a cautionary tale, especially when you're just looking at electrics, that if you're going to do a deep dive on data, it's important to look at a little bit older registration data, ideally 2020. So stuff is out of warranty. This is another flash of some data analysis I've done. This is different counties, Bay Area. We are going really, really deep on what makes what models, what areas, doing like very tactical direct mail and other drops. I've done other presentations on Earthling's marketing and how we're trying to activate this new group of customers. Not for today's presentation, but just to show that off a little bit. And happy to talk more about that and be able to bring more insights to you guys when I have them. This is a slide about data sources. You're gonna get a follow-up email from us with a basic article version of this presentation. So you'll get all this information at your fingertips and you can reference it in a little easier to consume format. And it includes all these links. But here are some links that you can use if you're in California, great. There's also some really good data on this site called Atlas EV Hub. And these are the states that are currently supported there. And then that also allows you to provide data back to 2020 versus just current data. So that's useful. For everybody else, US Department of Transportation is where you can get more detail. And that's where this E to G, D to G, magic number stuff all came from that website. I didn't, magically make it up. You can go, you can pull the data, you can do the ratios for yourself. And you could do them go forward, right? You could do them in a year if you're deciding to still hold on and see how the market matures. That data will be available too. Okay. Quickly, we'll go over sort of volume. I just want to look at like what's the size of the market, not just as a reference to gas cars, but here's California. You can see it absolutely dominates. It's 4.6x Texas, which is the second largest. So, California's got a lot of cars and it's got a lot of EVs. That's great. This is pure electric numbers, by the way. If we take California out of the mix, we can see how everybody else is doing. And again, you're going to have some hybrids in your area. Hybrids have obviously been around for a lot longer. And so you want to look at those together, but just looking at adoption and market trends, all the states that have an orange arrow next to them are states that have at least 2.5% of the total or greater. And that's useful to see volume versus just compared to other cars that are in your region. So, if you're going to specialize, for example, if you want to, really be first mover, plant your flag, go hard for, particularly EVs like I am, you need to have actual cars, right? Not just a sense of the mix as compared to your existing group. And these are the areas that have some meaningful concentrations. And you can see where your state is if it's not one of those states with an orange arrow, if it's creeping up behind. And so we'll see where that maturation continues to unfold. I had some additional data as it pertains to Earthling in particular. I think I can fly over that fairly quickly, Bryce, and then we can break for questions, guidance on that.
I think that would be great if you went through it.
Okay, cool. So here's some additional information specifically from my shop. And, this is more to kind of get a sense of what we're seeing and what the numbers look like in terms of revenue opportunities in these different markets. But, this is only in my market where it's just, highly concentrated. PS, that's why I located there. It's not necessarily going to track for where you are, but it can be useful. And so I'm going to showcase this here. One of the big things that I was struggling with when I had Luscious Garage, which is my previous shop, was that we had an aging customer base. This is a graph that comes out of Shopware Analytics. If you don't know where to find it, you go to Analytics, you go to Vehicles, and this is a date range up above it that allows you to select time. So on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is a graph of the dollars that my shop was generating over 6 months by model year. So you can see the peak is in 2008, which happens to be when they sold a lot of Toyota Prius. And if you were to go to previous times before May 2023, you'd see that same signature pattern over and over and over again, because that's the number of Prius they sold. We did a lot of hybrids, so those were the model years that we saw a lot of data on, or a lot of revenue on. But this is a problem because as many as, Prius as Toyota sold, they're just getting older. And if I'm specializing in those cars, eventually they're going to fall off a cliff. No one's going to want to fix them anymore. And then I don't have anything else that's coming in. So a big decision for us in going to pursue the EV market was we need to be able to attract newer cars. Where is the market going? And the decision was, do we want to go work on regular cars, in which case we're no longer specializing, or what's the new place to specialize? And ultimately we decided that that market was mature enough, and that was EVs. After I opened Earthling, this is sort of the first full 6 months that I had at Earthling on the left. You can see that we were still dealing with sort of leftovers from Luscious Garage, a lot of Prius. But then the 6 months after that, from November to April, you can see finally this plateau of revenue that's coming from newer cars. So that's great. It's working. And then finally on the far right, this is the most recent 6 months, May to October. Finally, we're making more money on newer cars, basically 2012 and newer, than we are on Prius, on the older Prius models, 2006, 2007, 2008. So hallelujah, all this marketing effort I'm making is actually, rendering results. So grateful for that. Right now we're doing about 15% pure electric, and of that 5% is Tesla. That might surprise you. It also surprises me. We expected to do more Tesla. We're currently doing about 1 Tesla a day. On average, we're doing 80 to 100 cars per quarter. So that's interesting. Within that 5% of Tesla, we do a lot of different stuff. So it's not like they need the same things over and over again. We do a lot of diags, and then we do alignments and tires. We're probably trying to bump up the tires because there's a bigger opportunity there. After Tesla, the greatest concentrations that we see are Chevrolets, like the Bolt and Volt, and the Fiat E. Fiat 500e is not a car that they sold very many of, but it's disproportionately popular in San Francisco. It's a small car. San Francisco is a hard place to park, and so they're very popular there, and that's great. So we love to see Fiat Es. We definitely specialize in them, and that's somewhat of the story, which is that actually a lot of our revenue, 21% of our total sales, comes from a miscellaneous drawer of cars, miscellaneous makes and models. They actually all have less than 1% of our revenue. And that's pretty interesting because you have to be trained up to work on all of those different cars. Some of that miscellaneous is, hybrid and just regular cars that we invite in. But a pretty significant portion of it is EV. And so, again, you got to be trained up to be able to address all those different cars. Here are the numbers for Tesla specifically. So you can see, again, this is in the last 6-month period. This is May to October of 2024, so fairly recent. The highest number of Tesla models we saw, 32 car count, is the Model 3. It's upper right-hand corner under car count. Next was Model S, then Model X, finally Model Y. Again, Model Y. They didn't sell them until 2020. Not a lot of them are out of warranty. So we see a lot more of the Model S, which is an old car, and the Model 3, which is when they started selling in 2016. So that's pretty cool. It's also interesting to see that we do a lot of Model S because that's the old car. And fortunately, that car, because it's old, needs work. So we like that. Now below in the chart on the left and the chart on the right, you get the breakdown of each of those models. So within Tesla Model S, you can see the model years that we saw, the revenue that we made, the ARO, and the number of cars. So the highest number of cars that we saw was Model S 2013 and 2014. You can see 8, and then that close second is 2016. I don't know what happened with 2015. I don't know. But whatever. 2013, 2014, 2016, that's the greatest number of cars. Cool. Also, if you just go over one column, that's the greatest number of average ticket. Super. Great. We're making money on those cars. We like that. Our average ticket generally is around 610, so we're a little bit lower on these cars, but it tends to be fairly bursty. You'll have stuff that just needs a diag or little stuff, and then you'll have a big spike. We've seen that on hybrids for many years. Over here on the right-hand side, you can look at Model 3. Again, 2018 is the lion's share of the cars, the older cars, and the ones where they sold the most of, like later on, people stopped buying the 3 and they started buying the Y. They don't sell as many of the 3 anymore. So back then, the 3 was your only option. They sold more of them. That's the most of them we see. And the ones that are a little older have a little higher ticket. So that's kind of interesting when you're thinking about the Tesla market. And last but not least, we're going to go into questions. You are going to get an article for this. So you'll get to read all about this on your own. Has all the E to G numbers and so on, as well as those resource links if you want to dig into more detail. If you're looking for hybrid and EV training, we have a dedicated website for that, earthlingtraining.com. Again, happy to talk to you more about what you're looking to do inside of your shop with your people. We will have a personal conversation with you about that. And we've been a long-time supporter, not a long time. We've been a supporter of Auto Service Leader to the extent Auto Service Leader has been out and about. And boy, are we happy that Auto Service Leader exists. Happy to be supporting them early on. And if you're not already checked into Auto Service Leader, that's their website there. It is the place to get information about what's going on in our industry. Incredibly high quality, and it's an absolute pleasure to get a chance to partner with them and with Bryce today. So on that note, I will stop sharing and we'll go into some questions.
Well, thanks, Carolyn. I appreciate that. And I mean, you were one of the earliest supporters because you supported us before anyone even knew we existed. So
I did. Okay. Well, I don't want to say that you're like a Johnny come lately because obviously you've been in the business a long time. But I am allergic to bullshit, so I don't want to go with my superlatives and stuff, and then everyone's like, "Wait a minute, someone's going to be fact checking this presentation." So, anyway,
I appreciate that.
Very grateful to be with you, Bryce. You're amazing.
Well, I don't know about that, but we appreciate you being here, and we do actually have a bunch of questions, so I want to dive right into them.
Do it.
One of the first ones with. What do you see as the rate at which the E to G numbers are growing? So if someone's state was on the right of those slides, when can they kind of expect to move to the left and cross that 4.0 threshold?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely saw more of it, not fairly recently, but more recently, because we saw a big jump in EVs. And then the EV sales numbers have started to go down as a rate of acceleration. So again, what you're pacing against isn't, how many more EVs are there. It's EVs as compared to gas car sales. So if people are still buying gas car sales and they're buying them at equal rates, then that ratio is going to stay the same. It's not until EVs overcome gas car sales that you see that grow. And then there's cars that are aging out. You might argue that, there's more gas cars aging out than EVs because EVs are newer. That could be a factor, but it may not change very quickly. And that's just a nature of sort of the sales climate right now for cars and for EVs in particular. Again, the opportunity is to go back and look at this again in a year, and you can do that, and we can do that.
Definitely. And you mentioned that opportunity that is there. So for someone who's looking at those numbers, obviously the ratio represents the entire marketplace, not necessarily how they are targeting customers through their marketing or potential customers. Can you talk a bit more about, you mentioned the first mover aspect of it and being the first to kind of jump into a niche within your market. Can you talk a bit about that and the opportunity that lies there?
I love first mover advantage, obviously. The idea is that when you get out ahead, you establish your name and you start building your expertise in front of your competition. And then once you have that, both reputation and expertise, hard for someone to ever catch you. No one's opened a hybrid dedicated repair shop in San Francisco. And I said, go right ahead, get in, the water's great. They're never going to beat me because I've been doing it too long. We're going to be too efficient. We're going to know exactly what we need to do. It's really hard to overcome that. So you have an opportunity to do that with EVs in your market. Additionally, when you get in early, you don't have to know all the answers. You can tell someone, I've not seen this car before, but we're absolutely prepared to work on it. Leave it with us and we'll figure it out. And then you'll be able to take that, and even though you lose a little bit of money on diagnostics up front, you can resell that knowledge over and over and over again for all those cars that follow. And the way it works is that someone writes a review on Yelp or wherever. It says, I brought my Model 3, my Tesla Model 3, keyword Tesla, And these guys did a great job. And then all of a sudden, all the Tesla Model 3s are calling your shop. So there's a great opportunity there. It is a challenge because in order to be first mover, means you have to be first. And you can see that might mean that your market's a little bit early. So you have to use your own judgment in terms of when are there enough cars that I think hanging my shingle, planting my flag, starting to talk about this is actually gonna, render results. When am I gonna actually generate revenue as a result of this? You can test it somewhat. It certainly doesn't hurt. What I will say is what you don't want to do is get out there, start making noise, and not be able to follow through, because then the opposite happens. Someone writes a review that you couldn't do anything and it was all a bunch of BS, and then that's really hard to try to get off of the web. But that's probably less relevant to this group because everybody here is pretty top notch.
Definitely. And for the people who are considering it, what do you see as a realistic timeline, I guess, of being ready to bring these services to market and jump in and try to capitalize on it?
So hybrid and EV training is more the work, right? So you're going to need to send someone to get trained. You can do it kind of in a more vehicle make agnostic way. Of course, you're going to be focused on Toyota Prius and Tesla Model 3Y. They're basically the same car. Of course, those are the greatest hits. Of course, you're going to focus on those. But within that panoply, you need to be ready to work on all kinds of stuff for the reasons I just showed you. So that's more of a hybrid EV approach. Or you can go get training specifically on Tesla. Again, happy to talk to you about that, earthlingtraining.com. To get into a class and then get the service information, stuff like that. Realistically, the training only takes, maybe it's 5 days if you did 2 different classes. But the, coming back, getting ready, making sure that you've got your message organized. You might want to have a couple cars come in and just see how they go first before you go harder into the marketing. Of course, invite your friends to bring their cars in and work on those, and then ask them to write that very favorable review. But maybe it's 3 months. The work really is once you start to make the effort from a marketing standpoint. How long does that take to mature? And as soon as I have that answer, I'll tell you, because I'm still working on it. We're clearly seeing a lot of EVs. In that last photo that I shared before I went to questions, this was from yesterday. The entire shop was full of EVs. We didn't have any hybrids in there. We had 2 Teslas, a RAV4 EV, a Fiat 500e, a Nissan Leaf, and a Smart 42. So it is happening. But it takes time for that to be a consistent thing. And it's going to vary depending on your market and the age of your market, like i.e. how many cars are out of warranty and looking for an aftermarket solution.
For sure. There's a question too pertaining to Teslas about Tesla parts and whether you've seen difficulty in obtaining those because they don't really have a wholesale program or immediate delivery. That's what the question said.
The good news is that your experience is unique to everyone who needs a part from Tesla, including Tesla dealers. So if your customer's car goes to the dealership, they're going to be waiting on parts, and they're going to be, having to manage with Tesla pricing. Tesla has had different dealerships marking up their parts differently. Obviously, they don't have a wholesale program right now. How you potentially price your parts in the Tesla concept is kind of on par with how do you price your parts against list price retail today. Do you use a matrix? Do you sell above because you're able to install this part for that person and offer a warranty, etc.? That same applies. Generally speaking, the people who are coming into Earthling who need Tesla repair are doing so either because they've already been to the dealer and the dealer didn't do a very good job. Bless their hearts. That always happens. If the dealership could have put us out of business, they would have done it already. They keep screwing it up. So there's that, in which case we might already have a diagnostic. We might already have a price. We can figure out how we can position ourselves and still sell the value. But for everyone else, it tends to be that it's really hard to get in, or they just don't trust. So it's less price oriented, in which case then you need to just sell the work based on how you need to make money in your business, which you already know. What's your labor rate? What's your parts markup? It's going to be, if it's a dealer only part, you're going to have to manage with the dealer only markup, just like you might do with all the factory parts that you buy. So it's actually fairly consistent with what we're already experiencing, with the exception that the cost of the part is going to be the same as the retail price. You're not getting an additional wholesale discount.
Right. Yeah, and the margins are slightly different. And then we had a question too about the tickets being slightly lower when working on most electric vehicles, at least the average ticket. Can you talk a bit about that and what you have seen so far with Earthling and what you expect, I guess, the future to look like in terms of that?
Of course, everybody is worried about whether we're going to make any money on electric cars. The good news, like this data is the actual data from the last 6 months. When I was doing a presentation and I had a different cohort of data, it was like, whatever, 2 months earlier or something, there was this huge spike in average ticket for Model S, which is great. We just had some expensive cars come through. And that's what I mean when I say it's kind of bursty. So when you look at like Prius repair, it's like oil change, oil change, oil change, oil change, hybrid battery, oil change, oil change, oil change. And you average all that out and you're left with obviously a lower average ticket. The goal is like, okay, I'm going to try and get the oil changes so that I can ultimately win the hybrid battery job when the time comes. And how do I just move those oil changes / maintenance services, whatever, through my shop as efficiently as I can so I can make the big dollars when the car breaks. On the Tesla side, what we see is a lot of diags, and sometimes the car can be fixed just on labor without having to sell anything. And again, we're just waiting for the cars to get older. So this isn't necessarily the case forever, but this is the case now as the cars are still fairly new. But the failures that we do see and the weird stuff that we end up fixing is oftentimes a result of the manufacturing process, which is to say that the cars were changed on the line all the time. There is no model year break. You have to know exactly when on Tesla, they have the car's birthday. You have to know the car's birthday to figure out what's on it and how it works. And so they were very iterative on the line. And as a result, there's not a lot of consistency. There's a lot of weird stuff. There's a lot of stuff that breaks. So we end up like right now, we got one that's got a bad, pin connection. So it's like pin drag is wrong. And then we also have another problem in like a connector that's not mating properly. Like it's just manufacturing defects. So that's the stuff that we're dealing with now. It's early and it can be fairly bursty. I wouldn't worry so much about if these cars are going to break. They're going to break eventually. The question is, how long is it going to take? It took us a long time to see hybrids start really breaking, and by God, they finally did. We're just going to have to do the same thing with EVs. My other shtick for folks that have seen it isn't so much that we don't care about oil changes or that electric cars are overly simple. The game is autonomy, right? When the car starts driving itself, it's going to be plenty complicated. And if it's an electric car, that doesn't matter. There's going to be plenty of things that we need to fix. So the car is getting complicated in other ways, and we're just trying to keep up with the technology. The downside, of course, is that it's skewing more towards labor. There's fewer part sales. We're all watching that. We all know that. And so the question is, how do you price your labor appropriately and stop expecting the same number of dollars strictly on parts GP? I will just throw in here, I know we need to end. Typically the ratio has been 1-to-1 labor dollars to parts dollars. Currently we see 1 labor dollar to 0.770 cents of parts dollars at Earthling today. I think it can be higher than that. We're working on that. But that's been sort of the industry benchmark, is that we're probably going to go down to 1 to 0.7. So 70 cents a parts for every dollar labor. So how do we just keep track of that and adjust accordingly? Sorry, Bryce, go ahead.
Interesting. No, it's great. I think we will wrap there because we are at the hour. But I want to thank you for being so transparent too with numbers and showing kind of behind the curtain of your shop. And for anyone else who wants to see more of Carolyn's shop and how Earthling is set up and how cars are moving through and everything, we do have a cool feature that Carolyn let us do. It's at earthling.autoserviceleader.com. You can check that out. There's videos of it. There's photos of her shop, all different things that kind of see behind the scenes of how she has it all set up. But we really appreciate you being on today and sharing all this. And
My pleasure. Thank you.
Definitely. Well, everyone take care. We appreciate you being here and happy holidays.
Thanks, everybody. Great to see you.